So today, we are continuing with our systematic study of the Bhagavad Gita with chapter 6, Dhyana Yoga, which translates in English to the study of meditation, the yoga of meditation. So, because it's been a couple weeks since we last did chapter 5, we had Christmas in between, the New Year's Eve, and then the start of the New Year, I thought we'll just do a quick, short recap on what we have accomplished so far in Bhagavad Gita. So quickly, this is a 30-second review. Chapter 1, we started off with Arjuna and Krishna going to the center of the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where they're meeting the two armies. And Arjuna sees on one side Dronacharya, Bhishma Dev, and the Kauravas, and on the other side it's him and his brothers, the Pandavas, and their army. And he sits in the middle of that battlefield and goes, I'm not going to fight, essentially. He just says, I'm not going to fight, straight up. And so at that point, he asks Krishna for guidance. And in chapter 2, we start off with Krishna accepting Arjuna as a disciple, surrendered unto him. And he's trying to give him instructions on the position of the soul and in comparison to the body. And how we are not the soul, but in fact the body. Sorry, no, we're not the body, we're in fact the soul. Almost messed that up. Moving to chapter 3, Krishna starts to give Arjuna an understanding of the different processes by which we can try to understand that position, that we are the soul and not this body, and how we can attain the supreme goal for each and every one of us, which should be to attain the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And he gives multiple different processes and different options to Arjuna to follow. So we start off in chapter 3 with Karma Yoga, or action. We move into chapter 4 with Jnana Yoga. Krishna is talking about knowledge and the cultivation of knowledge in pursuit of the Supreme Lord. Then chapter 5, we return to Karma Yoga, but it's more sannyas Karma Yoga, where it's action in Krishna consciousness, but not accepting the fruits of that work, and instead offering those fruits to the Supreme Lord, and in that way getting ourselves closer to the Supreme Lord. So now in chapter 6, we're about to enter the final process that Krishna is going to give before he enters a new section, quote-unquote new section of the Bhagavad Gita. And the final section before that is this Dhyana Yoga process. Now, in this chapter, we're actually going to see there's multiple different sections even within the chapter. So in a short summary, he actually starts with the chapter as a continuation of chapter 5. He's going to continue talking about sannyas and specifically Nishkama Karma Yoga, which is the process of action while renouncing the fruits of said action. Then we're going to move into Ashtanga Yoga, which is the eightfold yoga process. And this is the bulk of the chapter where we're talking about this eightfold yoga process, which involves some physical and mental yogic process in order to achieve the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And then towards the end of the chapter, I wrote conclusion, but that conclusion is actually quite strong because it essentially says, forget everything I've said this entire last 6 chapters. We're going to start something new from the next chapter, from this next point onwards. And that's the conclusion of the chapter, which leads us into this new section. So with that, I've done the summary of chapter 6, so we can, if we wanted, we could just end the chapter now and we could do some nice kirtan, so I like this idea more. But we will try to do a little bit more in-depth. So the rest of my slides at this point are just key verses from chapter 6, which I found and which I studied under a devotee who taught me the Bhakti Shastri course, some key verses from chapter 6, which explain these different stages within the chapter. So we'll get right into it with verse 2 from chapter 6. As I said, in the first 2 verses of this chapter, Krishna is still continuing on from chapter 5. So he's talking about Nishkama Karma Yoga. And he says, and you guys can repeat after me, Yam sanyasamiti prahur Yogam tham vidhi pandava Naha an sanyasta sankalpo Yogi bhavati kashana. Krishna says, what is called renunciation, you should know to be the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme, O son of Pandu. For one can never become a yogi unless he renounces a desire for sense gratification. So a couple key things in this verse, which he starts off the chapter with. First of all, he's talking about renunciation, or Nishkama Karma Yoga specifically. and how true renunciation is renouncing the desire for sense gratification. Oftentimes when we hear the word sannyas, we think it means, okay, I'm going to renounce everything, I'm going to go to the forest, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do my japa, and Arjuna in fact wanted to do that. If you remember in chapter 2, Arjuna tells Krishna, I'm not killing my relatives, I'm just going to go renounce everything, drop everything, go to the forest, sit there in a secluded place, and everything will be nice. I won't have to worry about killing all my family members and that bloodshed and the Varna Shankara, all the unwanted progeny that comes from that. And Krishna says, no, that's not what sannyas is, that's not the proper method of renunciation. And so he's again bringing it back up in this first verses of chapter 6, that the proper sannyas is renouncing the desire for sense gratification. Srila Prabhupada often says, and in fact in these first 2 verses of the purports, Srila Prabhupada says, as human beings, our constitutional position is that we must act. We cannot not act as human beings. As souls in this material world, we have to act. So this idea that we can just drop everything and enter this full just mode of samadhi or trance, which we're going to get to later in the chapter, is unrealistic. So the true renunciation is renouncing the desire for sense gratification. And Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, real sannyas yoga, or bhakti, he actually uses the term combined, means that one should know his constitutional position as a living entity and act accordingly. A person in Krishna consciousness has no opportunity to engage his senses in anything which is not for the purpose of Krishna. Therefore, a Krishna conscious person is simultaneously a sannyasi and a yogi. And this is a theme which we're going to see throughout this chapter. Srila Prabhupada very strongly in the purports of the entire chapter goes after this false idea of yoga. Because even nearly 50 years ago when Srila Prabhupada was writing these purports, the yogic processes of Ashtanga Yoga, Patanjali Yoga, these sort of physical and more mental ideations of yoga were quite prominent. I would say they're more prominent now. There's so many yoga studios around from in Houston. We have so many yoga studios, especially in the Arts District where the temple is located. Every other building will be some kind of yoga or meditation center, and oftentimes we go into kirtan and try to do this what we call quote-unquote mantra meditation, but for them, their yoga is coming in sweatpants and their tights and doing yoga mats and doing their bending this way, that way, and the other. And Srila Prabhupada, in multiple purports, goes into detail saying the true yoga, and he uses it in this translation, in fact, is linking oneself with the Supreme. Because throughout these last couple of chapters, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and now Dhyana Yoga, the key word is yoga. It's linking oneself with the Supreme. You can perform cultivation of knowledge, you can perform action, you can perform meditation, but if it is not for linking oneself with the Supreme, it is not that true yogic process. So those are 2 points from the start of this chapter. So now Krishna is done with Nishama Karma Yoga. He's going to move into Dhyana Yoga. He says, okay, Arjuna, here's another process by which you can attain me. If you cannot do action, if you cannot do cultivation of knowledge, maybe that's not your method for you. Here's another one. So he says, okay, now let's move into Dhyana Yoga, which is meditation. But, he says, there's a prereq. My youth will know, I guess everyone will know, but the college kids will know, when you go to college, when you want to take a certain class, you need to complete some prereqs for that class. When I was in college, I took a class called nucleic acids. I took a class called nucleic proteins. It was a whole class, 4 months, on just proteins. Don't do biochemistry majors, it's not fun. But it was a whole class, 4 months, and 2 classes. 1 class on nucleic acids and 1 class on proteins. Spent the entire semester. But in order to take that class, I had to take general biology, gen biochem, gen chem, physical chemistry. I had to take this whole variety of classes in order to reach that prereq. Just like this, for Dhyana Yoga, there is a prereq. And keep that in mind, because there's one yogic process for which there isn't a prereq. It's an intro-level class, which is also an advanced level class. We'll get into that a little bit later. But for Dhyana Yoga, there's a prereq. And the prereq is you have to have conquered and completely controlled your mind. Now that's very tough. It's very tough for us to understand. And we will see a little bit later in the chapter where even Arjuna himself is saying that is too much. It's too tough to control the mind. It's impossible. But for now, Krishna says, here's the prereq. And he says in verse 6, Bandhuratmatmanastasya
Bandhuratmatmanastasya
Yenatmevatmana jitaha
Yenatmaivatmana jitaha
Anatmanastu shatrutve
Anatmanastu shatrutve
Vartetatmeva shatruvat.
Vartetatmaiva satruvat.
For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. And then in the following verses, he continues to talk about this. For one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, heat and cold, honor and dishonor are all the same. A person is said to be established in self-realization and is called a yogi or mystic when he is fully satisfied by virtue of acquired knowledge and realization. Such a person is situated in transcendence and is self-controlled. He sees everything, whether it be pebbles, stones, or gold, as the same. A person is considered still further advanced when he regards honest well-wishers, affectionate benefactors, the neutral, mediators, the envious, friends and enemies, the pious and the sinners, all with an equal mind. So Krishna says, okay, you have to conquer your mind, you have to control your mind if you want to pursue this process of Dhyana Yoga. And he says, what is the qualities of someone who has conquered their mind? He explains, they see everything equally. Now, just from our standpoint, if you stop and think about it, it's very unrealistic, very tough to do that. As Ramchandra mentioned during the introduction, I'm in the medical field, I'm a medical student. So during this current third and fourth year, we have clinical rotations where we spend a couple weeks in different specialties. And throughout all the specialties, one common factor is that we have these meetings periodically, usually once every month and a half, where we have to get together with our preceptors and talk about biases in medicine. Because these biases exist where when you see a patient walk into your clinic or a patient walk into the emergency room, especially if it's someone you're seeing for the first time, you're automatically going to have some bias. You're going to have some bias against this person, whether it be because of socioeconomic factors, race, gender, whatever you have, they exist. And they try to tell us, okay, as medical professionals, as healthcare providers, you have to be able to try to keep these biases out of your mind when you're seeing a patient. You have to enter with a blank mind. And then the preceptors go, yeah, but that's almost impossible. So what you have to do is try to cope with it and try to keep yourself with an open mind. So they don't even have a solution for it for something as simple as something like a materialistic approach to seeing patients, to seeing people. What to speak of when you come to a spiritual aspect. When you're trying to understand that everyone's a soul within the bodies, every single individual, every single animal, every single entity you're seeing is part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, it's very hard because inherently our conditioned selves cannot accept that. We see each other based on some level of bias. And so when Krishna says you have to see each other between happiness and distress, heat and cold. I'm from Houston, Texas. It's not cold over there. They canceled my college when I was in college when it became 32 degrees, 32 degrees on the dot. They sent email blasts to everyone at 6 a.m. in the morning saying, please don't come into the college, stay at home, come at your own risk. If you get in a car accident, we're not responsible. They had to write all these things for 32. It didn't snow. No snow, no ice, nothing. It just was cold. It was cold outside and they were worried that people won't know how to drive in it. So they said, don't come to school. And I come here, now I've moved here in the last 8 months. This is my first winter here in New Jersey, and it's so cold. I cannot follow this where I've conquered my mind where I am in between heat and cold. I turn my heat on very high in the apartment. My dad was scolding, my parents visited me for the winter holidays and they were scolding me, why you're keeping the apartment so hot. So it's so hard to keep these dualities of the material world and try to conquer your mind so you're not comparing heat versus cold, happiness versus distress. And in order to see everything, pebbles, stones, or gold as the same, very tough. So already we're at a point, we're not even at the actual Dhyana Yoga yet. We're not actually at the yogic process, and we're already saying, oh, the prereq itself is hard. What are we going to do about the actual process? So Krishna gives this. He says, okay, you have to conquer your mind. In the purports of these verses, Srila Prabhupada says, listen, we're going to hear about Krishna speaking the process by which you can conquer the mind, but the easiest process is chanting the holy name. That is Srila Prabhupada's solution. Especially in this Kali Yuga, where our minds are even more chanchala, the word will come later, even more fickle and flickering, you have to find a method which will work in this age. And that method is chanting the holy name. So Krishna has given this prereq. Okay, conquer your mind. Say you conquered your mind. Say you successfully control your mind. You're able to keep between heat and cold and happiness and all that stuff. Now what do? And I've jumped at verse 20, but in between verse 6 and verse 20, Krishna goes into a lot of detail on specifics. So he says, okay, you have to sit on a mat of kusha grass with a deer skin in a secluded place at this time of the day, and you have to sit completely straight. That's an issue in myself. We have all these ergonomic chairs nowadays to make sure we're sitting properly, so we're not hunched over. And those ergonomic chairs don't even work properly, so that you're still not sitting properly. So what to speak of when you're trying to do meditation, you have to sit completely straight, aligned, all the chakras need to be aligned. You need to stare at the tip of your nose for hours and hours, try to concentrate on nothing else other than the Paramatma within your heart. You cannot eat too, Krishna says, you cannot eat too much or eat too little. You shouldn't sleep too much, you shouldn't sleep too little. I mean, we recommend in the medical field that you should sleep between 8 to 10 hours. I will tell you, there's a very common joke. Most medical professionals don't sleep 8 to 10 hours. We average about 5 to 6 hours of sleep every night. And that's when we're not working 24-hour or 36-hour shifts. So it's okay, we can't even follow that. What to speak, Krishna is saying you cannot sleep too much, cannot sleep too little. Cannot eat too much, cannot eat too little. All of these things, how to actually perform the actual yogic process. And what are we going to achieve if we do all of this yogic process? Krishna says in text 20, in the stage of perfection called trance or samadhi, one's mind is completely restrained from material mental activities by practice of yoga. This perfection is characterized by one's ability to see the self by the pure mind and to relish and rejoice in the self. In that joyous state, one is situated in boundless transcendental happiness, realized through transcendental senses. Established thus, one never departs from the truth, and upon gaining this, he thinks there is no greater gain. Being situated in such a position, one is never shaken, even in the midst of the greatest difficulty. This indeed is actual freedom from all miseries arising from material contact. So this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is actually what we're trying to achieve even in this process of Bhakti Yoga. We're trying to achieve this actual freedom. That's a very key word Srila Prabhupada uses the translation. This indeed is actual freedom from all miseries arising from material contact. That is what we're trying to achieve in Krishna consciousness. This is another process by which we can achieve that same thing. But it is so tough, it's almost impossible. You're trying to go through this process by which you're doing this meditation where you have to be so strict, you have to be so in such a regimen, that is very hard. Srila Prabhupada says in the purport that the best practice of yoga in this age is Krishna consciousness. He keeps saying this throughout this chapter. He's saying, yes, read what Krishna is saying. You must know what Krishna is saying about Dhyana Yoga. You must know about this meditation process, this Ashtanga Yoga process. But understand that in this age, the best process is Krishna consciousness. He says, a Krishna conscious person is so happy in his occupation that he does not aspire after any other happiness. There are many impediments, especially in this age of hypocrisy, to practicing Hatha Yoga, Dhyana Yoga, and Jnana Yoga, but there's no such problem in executing Bhakti Yoga. As long as the material body exists, one has to meet the demands of the body, namely eating, sleeping, defending, and mating. But a person who is in pure Bhakti Yoga or in Krishna consciousness does not arouse the senses while meeting the demands of the mind. Rather, he accepts the bare necessities of life and makes the best use of a bad bargain and enjoys transcendental happiness in Krishna consciousness. So yeah, if you want to try to do this Dhyana Yoga process, the process of meditation, you can do it. It's definitely possible. It's laid out how to do it, exact. You can follow it. But the reality of it is, our minds are so fickle, we have to act. We cannot not sleep, not eat, not mate, not defend. We have to perform action. So the best way to do it is instead Krishna consciousness, this process of Bhakti Yoga. And how I said earlier that for Dhyana Yoga there was this prereq of you have to conquer your mind. The one yogic process where there's no prereq is Bhakti Yoga. The initial stage of Bhakti Yoga and the advanced stage of Bhakti Yoga is the same. The action you're performing there is the same. You perform your prescribed duty while at the same time chanting the holy names of the Lord, Shravanam, Kirtanam, following the 9 processes of devotional service, associating with devotees, of course eating very nice prasadam, most important part. And through that process, you can achieve this same goal, which is this, at the end of this verse, Krishna says, actual freedom from all miseries arising from material conflict. It seems like a much easier route than this entire route of trying to meditate and attain this samadhi stage. So it just makes more sense to follow Krishna consciousness. So now, Krishna has told Arjuna, okay, there is dhyana yoga, you can do your meditation, you can sit and achieve this stage of samadhi. And Arjuna, and this is very key, Arjuna himself says in verses 33 and 34, Arjuna vacha,
Arjuna vacha,
yoyam yogastvaya prokta,
yoyam yogastaya prokta,
samyena madhusudana,
samyena madhusudana,
etasyaham na pashyami,
etasyaham na pashyami,
chanchalatvat sthitam stiram.
chanchalatvat sthitam sthiram.
Arjuna said, O Madhusudana, the system of yoga which you have summarized appears impractical and unendurable to me, for the mind is restless and unsteady. And then the next verse, this is a very famous verse, many people have heard of it, if not, or memorized it. Chanchalam himana Krishna,
Chanchalam himana Krishna,
pramati balavadhridam,
pramati balavadhridam,
tasyaham nigraham manye,
tasyaham nigraham manye,
vayoriva sudushkaram.
vayoriva suduskaram.
The mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong, O Krishna. And to subdue it, I think, is more difficult than controlling the wind. So this is Arjuna, right? Oftentimes, there's the common excuse given, oh, Arjuna says a lot of things in Bhagavad Gita, but it's just pastime. Maybe that's true. Maybe Arjuna is in fact a very elevated devotee of the Lord. He was Krishna's best friend. You cannot be Krishna's best friend unless you are very elevated and have some spiritual qualities. So be it. But Arjuna himself here is saying, Krishna, what you have said to me, it's impossible. I can't do it. And Arjuna was a warrior, a very steady person who could perform activities with complete determination. And all that being said, also, it was in a different yuga. It was in Dwapara Yuga, where people still had some level of spirituality. Some people still had higher qualities than the age that we're currently in, Kali Yuga. So if Arjuna himself is saying, oh, this is way too tough, this method, this practice you're giving me is too much, what to speak of us in this age of Kali, how can we perform it? Very tough, it's almost impossible. And Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, the mind is so strong and obstinate that it sometimes overcomes the intelligence, although the mind is supposed to be subservient to the intelligence. And then he says the easiest way to control the mind, as suggested by Lord Chaitanya, is chanting Hare Krishna, the great mantra for the deliverance in all humanity. The method prescribed is Save Mana Krishna Padharavindayo. One must engage one's mind fully in Krishna. Srila Prabhupada says in this purport that you should start that as early as possible, because at the time of death, it's going to be so hard to remember Krishna. What is the verse? Antakale chamameva swaran muktva kalevaram. At the time of death, whatever you remember, that's what you achieve. And the point of philosophy is, we're trying to remember the Supreme Lord. And it's so tough, because if you go back to the start of this chapter, we talked about that desire for sense gratification. That desire for sense gratification is what completely controls our mind. And real renunciation, which allows us to control our mind, is renouncing that desire for sense gratification. Ramchandra Prabhu mentioned that I was on pediatrics. I just completed my pediatrics, and I moved over to my next clinical rotation, which is now psychiatry. So I'm seeing a lot of patients who have mental health issues, and also I'm seeing a lot of patients who come in to the hospital who are at the end of their lives. And oftentimes, patients who come at the end of their lives are a little bit delirious. And because of that, they automatically get a psych consult. So psych goes down and talks to this patient, sees if medication might be useful. And earlier this week, I had a patient who came in, 90-something lady, like late 90s, who came in with terminal cancer. So her family she has had the diagnosis for the last 2 years. Doctors told her you have 2 to 3 years left, And at this point, when we're seeing her, her condition had deteriorated quite a bit. Her family had brought her into the emergency department and then admitted her to the floor because she was essentially at the end of her life. And in some moment of lucidity, because she was in a lot of pain at this point, the cancer has metastasized to most of the organs in the body. Most of her organs are in failure. But in some moment of lucidity, through the pain, she apparently told one of her family members or one of the nurses that I want to die, and that's automatically flagged as a suicidal intent. And so we in psychiatry are called to go see that patient, talk to them, see if medications are going to be necessary. So we get called, 90-something, and we're talking to this patient, and she's saying, she said, yeah, I said I wanted to die because I was in pain, but I actually don't want to die. I still have so many things I want to do in life. 90-something year old, she's lived 95, 96 years, I can't remember the exact age, but she's still in this desire for sense gratification. She's still saying, I have so many things I want to achieve, so many things I want to do. I don't want to die just yet. And I was preparing for this class and going through the chapter 6 and reading it, and it was on the same day, a couple of days after that, I went and saw the patient, and it felt like so real to me, so crazy that even at that age, 95, 96 years old, she's going to be thinking about her sense gratification, thinking about stuff she wants to do. Now, unfortunately, I have to tell you, she passed away the next morning, actually. About like 10 hours after we saw her, she passed away. The next morning, we went to go check on her, and she was no longer there. And so it got me thinking, what was she thinking about when she passed away? What was she potentially desiring that's going to affect her future births, her karma? And so it's so important for us to use this opportunity. Yes, conquering the mind is very tough. Renouncing that desire for sense gratification is super tough. I'm not going to sit here and say that I've done it and I've accomplished it. But we have to at least make the effort. And Srila Prabhupada gives us the most simplest method for doing that. Engage one's mind fully in Krishna. That doesn't mean we stop our action in the material world. It doesn't mean we stop performing our prescribed duties. It doesn't mean we stopped eating, sleeping. We don't stop doing those things. But we dovetail whatever we're doing towards Krishna consciousness, towards Krishna, and that we hope that by doing that, slowly but surely, we will be training our mind to think about Krishna more and more, so that at the time of death, so that at this position where we are in so much pain potentially, we are still remembering Krishna compared to the desires we have and the sense gratification that we want to achieve. So Arjuna says, okay, I cannot do this possibility of yoga. But he says, what if I had started and I have not finished it? What happens then, Krishna? Because some of us will do 50%. So Krishna says in about 3 verses, and these are 3 quite important verses, and Srila Prabhupada stresses these verses in the purport, but also in other places he has consistently talked about these verses. So text 41, then unsuccessful yogi, after many, many years of enjoyment on the planets of the pious living entities, is born into a family of righteous people, or into a family of rich aristocracy. Or, if unsuccessful after a long practice of yoga, he takes birth in a family of transcendentalists, who are surely great in wisdom. Certainly, such a birth is rare in this world. On taking such a birth, he revives the divine consciousness of his previous life, and he again tries to make further progress in order to achieve complete success, O son of Kuru. So the pastime which most relates to this topic is the pastime of Janabharat. Many will have heard the pastime already, but for the short form of the pastime is King Bharat, after whom the entire world was named Bharatvarsha. At the end of his life, he retired to the forest in order to perform austerities and pass away. But during that time, when he was supposed to be performing spiritual activity, and he performed many spiritual activities, he also adopted a deer, a baby deer, a fawn. I think it's called a fawn. And he started caring for the deer so much that he forgot his spiritual activities and instead completely thought about the deer. And once again, this goes back to the point we just made about at the time of his death, instead of thinking about the spiritual life, instead of thinking about Krishna, he thought about the deer. So he came back as a deer. But that spiritual, transcendental activities that he performed in his life as King Bharat, towards the end of his life, always stayed. And so after his life as a deer, when he was in his next birth, he came as Jada birth, and he was born to a Brahmin family, and he was able to immediately revive his Krishna consciousness, his spiritual activities. And of course, we know he then meets King Rahugana, and they have wonderful discussions on spiritual topics. And actually, King Rahugana accepts Jadabharat, who was essentially in exile from society at this point, because he didn't want to have anything to do with society. But King Rahugana accepts Jadabharat as a spiritual master. And Srila Prabhupada refers to these verses quite often in other places. I've read multiple places, because he would often talk about children within the Krishna conscious society as Vaikuntha children. It was a very, very common phrase he used, Vaikuntha children. Because he used to say, the fact that that these devotee children are born into the devotee families must mean that they were very, very advanced transcendentalists in their previous lives. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, because yes, I was born into a devotee family. I promise I'm not doing that. But it was the reality. Prabhupada said that these people, and all of us who have come into whatever stage we have, it must mean that we had some bank balance of this spiritual activity, some bank balance of this transcendental credit that allowed us to come into Krishna consciousness so quickly, take it up with commitment and dedication. And so Srila Prabhupada made it a point to make sure that these children received education, received that continuity of spiritual activity from an early age. And Ramchandra Prabhu mentioned, I was completely homeschooled from 1st grade through 12th grade, never went to public school. And that was a similar reason to why. My spiritual master, who's also my parents' spiritual master, instructed my parents that all children who are born have some spiritual activity. So use this opportunity, because we're already, say, 70, 80, whatever percent through the transcendental process, which is why we've been born or been able to come into Krishna consciousness so quickly in our lives. Use this opportunity to pursue Krishna consciousness. And that was what my parents did. They allowed me to, in a homeschooling, build that foundation of Krishna consciousness. And it wasn't like, oh, he's gonna become a complete sadhu, he's gonna go take sannyas and things. No, again, that's false sannyas. True sannyas is just renouncing the desire for self-gratification, which I'm not saying I've done. But academics were stressed. Importance on following prescribed duties were stressed, which is why I've gone into, did college. I'm now in medical school. I'm going to be a doctor in a couple of years. Right? The action does not go away, but building that foundation of Krishna consciousness and starting from an early age in Krishna consciousness is important, because we have Krishna, as Krishna is saying, the reason we're born into this family of transcendentalists is because of this credit that we have. So this is getting towards the end of the chapter. So Krishna explains this to Arjuna. This is what happens. And then he gives the big conclusion of the chapter. And he says, okay, Yoginam api sarvesham madgatena antaratmanah Shraddhavan bhajate yomam same yukta tamomata. And of all yogis, the one with great faith, who always abides in me, thinks of me within himself, and renders transcendental loving service to me, he is the most intimately united with me in yoga and the highest of all. That is my opinion. So Krishna has done now 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita. He's done Karma Yoga, he's done Jnana Yoga, he's done Dhyana, Ashtanga, and Nishkama Karma Yoga in chapter 5. He's done all these yogas. He said, okay, this is the process. He spent time. And then he says, and this is the last verse of the chapter, he says, forget everything I've said. Similar to what he will say eventually in chapter 18, but he says, forget everything I've said, because the one who is the best, the one who is the highest, is one who just has great faith and renders transcendental loving service. That's Bhakti Yoga. So essentially, he's saying, okay, forget the last couple chapters. Like, yeah, you need to know them because they're processes which are established in the Shastra. They're processes which can be followed, but the reality of it is, the best process is Bhakti Yoga. And Srila Prabhupada in the purport says, the culmination of all kinds of yoga practices lies in Bhakti Yoga. All other yogas are but means to come to the point of bhakti in Bhakti Yoga. yoga actually means bhakti yoga. Very important. Yoga doesn't mean the twisting, turning of the limbs inside out, urta purta, I'm Telugu, so I use urta purta, inside, all of the things. It's not that. Real yoga is bhakti yoga. And all other yogas are progressions toward the destination of bhakti yoga. From the beginning of karma yoga to the end of bhakti yoga is a long way to self-realization. In this chapter, Krishna talks about Ashtanga Yoga. And when one surpasses Ashtanga Yoga and comes to the point of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it is called Bhakti Yoga. Factually, Bhakti Yoga is the ultimate goal. But to analyze Bhakti Yoga, one must understand these other yogas. So we have to know these other yogas. We can't just not know them. But now knowing them, we can make the choice to use the elevator versus the stairs. It's a common ISKCON analogy. Like, okay, we can use the elevator instead of using the stairs. Stairs is, yeah, you can do this yogic ladder, which we talked about a couple of chapters ago. Yeah, we can do the karma yoga, then progress to jnana yoga, then progress to nishkama karma yoga, then progress to ashtanga yoga, then progress to dhyana yoga, and then you can get to bhakti yoga. But now that we know the process, we can jump that. We can just take the elevator straight up to the floor of bhakti yoga. So that is the summum bonum of what this entire chapter is. And oftentimes it is said that the Bhagavad Gita is split into 3 sections of 6 chapters. And if anyone's good at math, 18 divided by 6 is 3. So this 6th chapter, Jai Shri Shyam Sundar Ki, Shri Nimai Nitai Ki. So 18 divided by 6 is 3. So if you did the math, the 6th chapter is technically the end of this first quote-unquote section of Bhagavad Gita, where yes, we talked about the yoga ladder. And now we're about to enter the second 6 chapters, which will talk about bhakti yoga. And Krishna spends the whole 6 chapters, starting from chapter 7, where he talks about knowledge of the absolute, then attaining the supreme, then confidential knowledge, and then opulences, and then of course there's 11 in between where he does the universal form. But then chapter 12, which is bhakti yoga. It's like these 6 chapters are going to be talking completely dedicated to bhakti yoga. So when we study for exams, the medical school buzzword is high yield. Like, we only like to study stuff which is high yield. Don't worry, as doctors, we're making sure we study everything, so we'll know everything. But so you please come to me when I become a doctor. I really need the business still. But for our exams, for the case of our exams, it's all about high yield. What's high yield? There's all these documents out there which exist, which people sell, which is like, okay, this is going to be high yield for the exam. You should know these diseases compared to other diseases. Other diseases, yeah, you don't need to know them. You should know them, but you don't need to know them. But for the exam, you need to know high yield. So, if we're looking at the Bhagavad Gita, what is high yield in the Bhagavad Gita? The most high yield topic in the Bhagavad Gita is Bhakti Yoga. So obviously, if we're studying for this examination of our lives, examination of death is often called the final examination, then we should be studying the high yield topics. And what is that the most high yield topic? Bhakti Yoga. So essentially, this entire chapter, I've said a lot, but you can forget everything else I said, because now the final thing is just do Bhakti Yoga. Understand Bhakti Yoga. And across these next couple of chapters, we're going to start exploring that a lot more. So with that is all I have. Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm suitable to answer questions, but please, if anyone's willing to add any comments, corrections, any of the realizations they've had about anything that I've said, please feel free to add.
So my question is Bhakti Yoga is basically employing your emotion to reach the Supreme Personality of Godhead, right? So, but isn't it much quicker if we use everything, like for example using Hatha Yoga for body, mind, like the intellect, the Jnana Yoga, and for the prana to control that, like pranayama, and emotion, Bhakti Yoga. Can't we do everything rooted in the devotion, but also do meditation, do Hatha Yoga, do pranayama? Isn't it much quicker?
about it, is it much quicker? I don't personally know if it's much quicker. According to Srila Prabhupada says it's not much quicker. If you think about it, yes, all of those paths which are stated are correct paths. That's the key thing to understand. Yes, we talk about Bhakti Yoga a lot, like, oh, Bhakti Yoga. Doesn't mean that other paths are not correct paths. Srila Prabhupada talks in the purports about the Patanjali Sutras, which are established in Vedic scriptures, and the use of Hatha Yoga, and the use of Jnana Yoga, cultivation of knowledge. The key important thing, especially in the modern day, is that it's many times, I said at the start of the talk, yoga is linking one to the Supreme. And oftentimes, what has happened is the processes of Hatha Yoga, which have become mainstream to a certain extent, are no longer used properly for linking oneself to the Supreme. They're used for gaining physical strength. And Srila Prabhupada always said, you must take care of your physical health. They're used for gaining mental solitude and mental fortitude, which again, you must have that. If your mind is going everywhere, you cannot perform Bhakti Yoga also. The reality of it is, in order to reach this position where we're using Hatha Yoga or Jnana Yoga or even Karma Yoga to a certain extent to completely achieve the Supreme Lord, can be quite tough. And which is why Srila Prabhupada recommends that Bhakti Yoga is a very simple process. Now, it can take many, many lifetimes even for Bhakti Yoga. Our goal is to try to commit ourselves as much as we can in this life to try to get over it in one life. That's the plan. But even Bhakti Yoga can be so tough. But the process, especially in this age, is so much more simpler. It's just chanting the holy names of the Lord, listening, chanting, and of course taking prasadam, reading the Shastra. That's my understanding, at least.
Thank you.
Yes, Prabhu.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji. Damodar Prabhu. You keep the doctors very high, so. So, very, very wonderful presentation. I would like to know, more about how Arjuna speaks about the controlling mind and what the Lord replies really. You know, Arjuna puts. You give the question, but like doctor, you're an ideal doctor. Just give the question, but you give the answer also. Please give the answer also for that. How Arjuna asks that, and please give the answer also. What was the Lord's reply? How to control the mind?
So, Krishna says in order to conquer the mind, you must take yourself to a secluded place and completely shut yourself off from everything that's happening. He says that you must focus your eyes on the tip of your nose and completely concentrate only on Paramatma. And the idea is, Dhyana Yoga is the ultimate goal. Krishna talks about Yoga Arudaksha and Yoga Yogartama. There's two processes. I'm saying the words very badly. I butchered the Sanskrit pronunciation. But in this chapter, Krishna talks about Yoga Aruksha. Yoga Aruksha is the initial stage of Ashtanga Yoga. And in that process, you perform Ashtanga Yoga, which is eightfold yoga system, which uses physical and mental exercises essentially to conquer the mind. When we perform that, you then reach the stage called Yoga Ardhatama. I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Yoga Arudha.
Yeah. When you reach that stage, that is actual Dhyana Yoga. That is the stage where you're then performing just meditation. And in that, the practice of that will take you to the level of Samadhi and trance.
So, Prabhu, I wanted to, Arjuna asked that question, right after that, Lord Krishna answered that. Abhyasa, he says right after that, when Arjuna asks this question, Chanchalami Mana Krishna, right after the Lord Krishna is answering that verse. I'm not remembering that verse, but that Abhyasa, the Kaunteya, Vairagya.
Oh, practicing detachment. Yes.
Can you please speak about that verse, please?
Yeah, so Arjuna asks, okay, I believe that's in the earlier part of the chapter.
37, 38.
Yeah.
Where
35, right? Yes.
35, yeah.
So Arjuna says, okay, mind is very hard to control. It's more than the wind, and Krishna uses the example of the flame flickering in the wind and how you have to control it as if the flame. And Krishna explains the process through detachment. The analogy used is chopping down the tree. of the attachment. You have to, and that's through the process of Srila Prabhupada says in the purport that the best way to do that is through the process of devotional service. Abhyasa, to constant practice. You don't, it doesn't happen instantly. You have to do it through constant practice. That's mine.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. I have a question. You said that we should engage our mind in Krishna devotion all the time, right? So if I apply that to my daily life, like if I'm chanting his name all the time, so like each and every moment, I start forgetting things, like what's going on around me. When I go to pick up my kids, I would pick up just one kid and come back. And like I go to grocery store and I buy one thing, and I would go to another store and buy same thing again. So sometimes I feel like I'm losing it. Like, how do I balance that? Like, while chanting his name and being in the real world, like it's a problem for me. Like, sometimes people just start screaming on me when I'm driving and chanting his name. Like, they start honking. I have no idea, like, what's going on around me.
There's probably many devotees. There's probably many devotees who can better answer the question than me. Growing up, it was probably a lot more easier. As I said, I was homeschooled. So the idea was, yes, our ultimate goal is to have constant remembrance of Krishna. That is the ultimate goal, which is why at that time of death we'll be able to remember Krishna. The reality is, yes, you're right. You have to still perform your actions in daily life. You still have to pick up your kids from school. You still have to go to the grocery store and buy things. So the reality is we try to dovetail as much as we can. So yes, maybe it's not about chanting even out loud or even in your mind constantly the holy names, but you try to turn every action somehow into Krishna. So at least you're even if you're not actively thinking about Krishna, you're thinking, okay, I'm buying this whatever, this vegetable or this fruit or whatever. Okay, I'm going to be using this to offer to Krishna. Or even when you're driving, we often say that the easiest way is you're just playing the kirtan or the class of the Lord. Because yeah, you might not be actively chanting it out loud or in your mind even, but that inherent the shravana, the hearing, is happening. So you're still gaining some the benefit. Yeah, of course, eventually the goal is to be constantly remembering Krishna, and there's people who have achieved that. Many of the senior devotees of Prabhupada, many of the senior devotees of the movement, every single moment is thinking about Krishna, how they can serve the devotees better. But as neophytes, that I am especially, we are trying to take this step by step and try to dovetail. I've never actually seen a dove's tail before, but I'm going to take people's word for it that it actually curves. So we try to dovetail everything that we're trying to do somewhat towards Krishna.